In the late 18th century, the eminent Scottish geologist James Hutton produced his seminal work, Theory of the Earth. This sparked many geologists, both professionals and amateurs, to look more closely at the Earth's crust. One of these amateurs was Cromarty-born Hugh Miller. Miller was born on 10th October 1802 to Hugh Miller and his wife Harriet Wright, in a house which his grandfather had purchased when he was a buccaneer in the Spanish Main. His father had also earned good money from his sailings to India and China, where he sold curios to the locals. He returned to Cromarty with £400 when he was 30 years old, after he'd been press-ganged into the Navy. This enabled him to purchase a coastal sloop and a house. Not long afterwards, he was appointed as an agent for the Leith Glassworks, working the North and the Hebrides for the company. One day his sloop was forced to take shelter at Peterhead because of a storm, but on 9th November 1807 he made the fatal decision to set sail. The boat foundered and all hands were lost, including Miller. Hugh was just 5 years old. When he was 6, Hugh attended the local parish school. Over time, he began reading the books his father had collected, including Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels. A few years later, his interest in Scottish literature was born when he read Blind Harry's Wallace. During his school days, Miller took to telling his fellow classmates stories. These included tales of his uncle and versions of the books he read. When school was over, Hugh's uncle Alexander would take him up the hill of Cromarty or along the shoreline, and it was here he first became interested in nature. But family life became more difficult. He was unruly and at one stage stabbed a friend in the thigh with a knife he carried. But this was after his mother remarried and he found it hard to adjust. When he was 17, he decided to become a stonemason. He believed this would provide him with an income as well as give him plenty of leisure time to pursue his interests. Miller later said he had no wish and no peculiar fitness to be either a lawyer or a doctor, and as for the church, that was too serious a direction to look in for one's bread. He became apprenticed to an uncle from his mother's side as a mason and quarryman at the southern shore of the Cromarty Firth. He was bound to the apprenticeship from February 1820 until November 1822. He'd been a wanderer among rocks, a reader of curious books, a gleaner of old traditional stories, and now he was going to exchange all of his daydreams and pleasures for the kind of life in which men toil every day that they may be enabled to eat. The work was physical and hard, and he began a lifelong battle with depression, which started while he was at the quarry. He no longer had time to pursue his love of nature either. The money was poor, and he found he had to look for odd jobs to supplement his income. When he completed the apprenticeship, work took him to Geological as part of a working party to transform buildings for the local laird in the autumn of 1823, but he was no longer satisfied with the Highland way of life and believed that Edinburgh would hold much better prospects. There was another reason. His father had been left property in Leith, which was now in disrepair, and he was named as the ratepayer. With the money he'd saved, he took a ship to Leith with a view to paying off all the debt and working on the property himself in order to sell it. On arrival, he found that work was hard to come by. Eventually, he was introduced to a builder who was constructing a mansion on the south side of Edinburgh. Following the Great Fire that swept through Parliament Close and the High Street, he found steady employment, working long hours. However, the dust from his craft began causing him breathing difficulties, and the house he had been left was complete, and with £50 profit he made from its sale, he took the boat to Cromarty to clear his lungs. He ended up staying there for 10 years. In June 1828, Miller visited Inverness and placed an advert in the local papers for employment. He also submitted verses in hope that potential employers would see he was a learned man. But this proved fruitless, so he decided to try his hand at being published. Over the years, he'd written verses and took some of them to the Inverness Courier office. The editor, Robert Carruthers, read the work and published Poems Written in the Leisure Hours of a Journeyman Mason in 1829. Sir Thomas Dick Lauder took notice of the work, as did a friend of Carruthers, Principal Baird. Baird tried to persuade him to go back to Edinburgh and become part of the literary circle, but Hugh wanted to stay where he was for the time being. One day, while he was wandering through the woods which overlooked the Cromarty Firth, he met a young woman. This was Lydia Fraser, a teacher, who later became his wife. The young couple made plans to emigrate to America, but in 1833 an opening arose in the Commercial Bank of Scotland for Hugh to work in as an accountant. He headed to Edinburgh for training before returning to work in Cromarty's first bank. Before he left for the capital, he'd been working on his Scenes and Legends of the North of Scotland. It was a traditional history of the area, and the manuscript was forwarded to Lauder, to whom it was dedicated. Through him, Hugh was introduced to Adam Black, the publisher, and terms were agreed to publish the book. Hugh had a number of issues occupying his thoughts, not least the church. He'd been a member of the established church, but turmoil within it came to a head. Traditionally, the church had patrons who could put forward a candidate for the local ministry without consulting the congregation. It was now seen as the landed gentry and aristocracy having too much say in ecclesiastical affairs, and many were against such interference. Hugh, too, had been concerned about the influence the state had over the church. In 1840, as his thoughts became known, he was appointed editor of The Witness, a bi-weekly newspaper based in Edinburgh, which he would edit for the next 16 years. In 1843, the church was split, and Hugh was at the event. On 18th May, he watched as over 400 clergymen walked out of the meeting of the General Assembly in Edinburgh and saw the birth of the Free Church of Scotland, of which he became a member. Hugh later wrote that a painting of William III, that had held its place in Holyrood for nearly a century and a half, dropped heavily from the walls. Away from Edinburgh, Hugh embarked on a journey round the Hebrides in 1844, which culminated in his book The Cruise of the Betsy, which was published posthumously. Other works included First Impressions of England in 1845, and 2 years later, Footprints of the Creator. He also wrote a sketch on The Geology of the Bass, which he contributed to a larger volume, but it was his intention to write a full geological account of Scotland, and include this work. However, he died before this idea came to fruition. 1854 saw the publication of My School and Schoolmasters, which had originally been printed in the Witness. In 1856, Miller became paranoid about his geological specimens, which he housed in his home at Shrub Mount in Portobello. Garrote robberies were prevalent that year in Edinburgh, and he feared someone would steal his precious finds. Since his time at Cromarty, when he had to take money between the town and Tain, he'd carried a gun with him in case he was attacked and robbed. Now in Portobello, he took to sleeping with a firearm close by to protect his museum. His nights were restless too, as his damaged lungs from his stonemason work caused his sleep to be broken, and he frequently had bouts of sleepwalking. Often, when he woke up in the morning, the first thing he did was check his clothing, believing they had been touched by evil spirits. He was overworked and lacked sleep, so he was urged to see a doctor. On 24th December 1856, Hugh had been working on editing his book, Testimony of the Rocks. After dinner, he retired to his study. On Christmas morning, his body was discovered, with a bullet through his left lung. On the nearby table was a letter he'd written to his wife. He'd written, "My brain burns, I must have walked, and a fearful dream rises upon me. I cannot bear the horrible thought. God and Father of Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me. Dearest Lydia, dear children, farewell. My brain burns as the recollection grows. My dear, dear wife, farewell." On the 26th, an inquest found he'd committed suicide under the impulse of insanity, and when his funeral took place, it was one of the largest Edinburgh had ever seen. He was buried in the Grange Cemetery in the city. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.